Welcome, friends. We're going to be beginning in just 5 or 6 minutes. Those of you who are joining us here on Zoom, you're welcome to type your questions on the side, and Chrissy Fung will help us curate those questions so that we can ask them. We're waiting for the rest of our panelists, and this is also being simulcast on Facebook. So if you'd like to ask questions on Facebook, feel free to do so. We have friends who'll be helping curate questions there as well. And we will get to all of these questions eventually. And friends who are just joining us, I see we have a lot of new people just joined us here in Zoom. We're going to begin in just a few minutes as we're waiting for our final panelists. This is being simulcast in our Milwaukee Turners Facebook group. We're very grateful that you're joining us here for the debut of the Vel Phillips Forum from the Milwaukee Turners. We're really excited for this afternoon's conversation. Those who have questions, feel free to ask them in chat. You'll see our panelists are active in chat as well. This is being simultaneously live streamed on Facebook. So if you jump over to the Milwaukee Turners Facebook page, feel free to share that there as well. And of course, this will be edited down to a mere hour and a half and then posted on YouTube. And a lot of what we say during this first one will be turned into slides. Yes, such a beautiful day for a Zoom. Very true, Martha. We're going to begin.
Beautiful day for a Zoom and some culture wars, you know.
Welcome, friends. We're going to begin in just a couple of minutes more. We are very lucky to have Angela Harris joining us, and she is a teacher, so she's going to get here. Man, she is dedicating her lunch break to us. How important is that? I think that's great. So
you know, that really sets the table, I think, for the importance of the conversation. You know, what we're facing is this. Well, we'll get into it, but our teachers, K-12 in particular, are so valuable and so important and so dedicated, and to see some of them under assault is disturbing in the least, and any other words in the most, you know.
I agree. I shared something earlier, a parent anonymously shared with me from their parking lot. I think it was in Greenfield for the first day of school. And again, it's just a flag for the culture wars. This individual has a bumper sticker on the car. It says, "All lives splatter. We don't care about your protests." And they're there walking around next to all of these parents taking their little ones to school. Blatant disregard. With that, friends, I see we've got a lot of new folks joining us here and also on Facebook. So I'm going to begin while we wait for our final panelists to join us. My name is Emilio Torre. I'm the executive director of the Milwaukee Turners. And I just want to tell you how excited the Milwaukee Turners are. We're thrilled to present the premiere of the Vel Phillips Forum this afternoon. We're very grateful that her son, Michael, gave us his permission and his blessing for this endeavor. Vel has been a guest here in Turner Hall many times, and many Turners are proud to have been friends with her. Indeed, we're only too happy to help rename downtown 4th Street, where our hall resides, after Ms. Phillips. The Milwaukee Turners are one of the oldest civic groups in the state, begun in 1853, and we've worked to promote sound minds and sound bodies through our principles of liberty against all oppression, tolerance against all fanaticism, reason against all superstition, and justice against all oppression since then. And it seems that the battles today are no less important to our identity as Americans and Milwaukeeans as they were, or than they were back then. Since today is the first of what we hope are many broadcasts, I'm going to begin with a longer than usual introduction and welcoming to the many people and groups who are helping us fulfill the important Turner tradition of having forums. Forums as important as the ones we held in our halls to help bring about the 8-hour workday, women's suffrage, and the resistance to odious and criminal actions such as slavery and fascism. In reality, the Vel Phillips Forum is a reincarnation of these older forums, or fora, which were embodied so many years by the 4th Street Forum, which met here and was also aired on PBS. We invite you all to come visit the Turner Hall Gymnasium, the Turner Hall Ballroom, or our 8,000 square foot restaurant, for whom we're currently searching a new operator. Today's presentation is being co-sponsored by Marquette University Center for Urban Research, Teaching, and Outreach, MICA, which is Milwaukee's Inner City Congregations Ally for Hope, the Milwaukee Jewish Community Relations Council, the National Lawyers Guild of Milwaukee, Erasism Milwaukee, Toasted Together, and of course, Wisconsin Voices. We anticipate over a dozen additional co-sponsors as the outpouring of support, even before our first broadcast, has been phenomenal. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge personally now our incredible advisory group, which is ever expanding currently, and includes a lot of wonderful folks, names you may all know from Milwaukee: Adam Carr, Professor Mike Carrier, Molly Collins, Mark Denning, Jarrett English, Chrissy Fung, who you'll see here as a co-producer in helping us curate this, Professor Nat Godley, Bernie Gonzalez, Professor Lane Hall, Art Heitzer, Arnita Hulleman, Lisa Jones, Emily Kapchkevich, Liza Kessler, Professor Isa Kohler-Hausman, who was instrumental in starting the first 4th Street Forum here, Professor Walt Lanier, Ben Lindsay, Martha Love, Kika Miraz, Kai Mishlav, Tariq Moody, David Mohammed, Shannon Ross, Rebecca Salada, and Pancho Sanchez, Professor Robert Smith, Professor Amber Tucker, Brandon Williford, and Nicole Yunk-Todd. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our panelists for the first Vel Phillips Forum. This is episode 1, focusing on history, censorship, and the culture wars. As I mentioned before, Chrissy Fung is co-hosting, and she's helping produce the episode and will assist in curating questions. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat, as well as on Facebook, and we will bounce back and forth answering those. I know our panelists are also active in the chat, and I will verbalize some of the responses there to those following along. And again, this is being recorded and will be shared on YouTube. We hope eventually to make this a hybrid, and folks can actually meet downstairs in the first floor meeting room, as well as online. So history, censorship, and the culture wars. Why are politicians suddenly attempting to create legislation governing school curricula? And what is critical race theory, and how is this affecting our children in schools? Today, we'll be joined by panelists Dr. Nat Godley, Angela Harris, Dr. Robert Smith, and Tomika Vukovic as we explore this topic. I'm going to briefly introduce our 4 panelists, and then we're going to move into the conversation. We're joined here today from originally in Miles Morales' bedroom there, Nat Godley. Dr. Nat teaches classes on world history, the Middle East, migration, and colonialism at Alverno College. He's also active in local civil liberties and anti-racism circles. Living in Greendale with his wife and 2 high schoolers, one of whom is Black, makes him particularly concerned with the welfare of students of color in suburban schools, alongside the inequalities suffered by their peers in the city. Angela Harris, who uses she, her, hers, is a 4th year first grade teacher at Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. African American Immersion School, and is also chairwoman of the Black Educators Caucus in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She is an abolitionist educator who is passionate about creating educational spaces where Black children are thriving. She is devoted to providing education to create accessible, inclusive, and uplifting environments in coalition with families, students, and the community. She is also a wife and proud mother of 3 children. Dr. Robert Smith. Dr. Robert Smith is the Harry G. John Professor of History and the Director of the Center for Urban Research, Teaching, and Outreach at Marquette University. His research and teaching interests explore the intersections of race and law. Dr. Smith is the author of Race, Labor, and Civil Rights, Griggs versus Duke Power, and the Struggle for Economic Employment Opportunity. He is also the author of Black Liberation from Reconstruction to Black Lives Matter. Prior to joining Marquette University, Dr. Smith served as the Associate Vice Chancellor for Global Inclusion and Engagement and Director of the Cultures and Communities Program at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Dr. Smith also volunteers as the resident historian for America's Black Holocaust Museum in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Rob is the proud father of Henderson Marcellus Smith. And finally, my friend Tomika Vukovic, who is also the Finance and Administration Manager for the Milwaukee Turners here at Turner Hall. In addition to having over 20 years experience in finance, she is the first Black woman elected to public office in the city of Glendale, where she currently serves as an alderwoman, as well as serving on the police commission and the school board. Tomika lives in Glendale with her husband and her brilliant daughter, who is entering her first year of college. Welcome, panelists. Thank you so much for joining us. I guess I'd like to begin, and certainly all of you are free to chime in whenever you'd like. But I'd like to begin with some place setting. If, you know, this all seems so overwhelming. It's gone from 0 to 100 in a matter of moments, although some rightfully point to this is just the latest phase and iteration in a cultural war to advance white supremacy at the expense of history and dignity of non-white people. And at this instance, and sadly in this case, at our babies who are going to school in K through 12 institutions. Rob, Professor Smith, I'm going to pick on you first since I'm holding this lovely book you helped author right next to me. And it smells like it needs to be autographed. I'm hoping you might begin and kind of help us play set.
Yeah, let me say a couple things to kind of to respond. I think first of all, part of what we're challenged with is an upsurge in commentary, critiques, and attacks from folks who are woefully uninformed about this body of thought, this school of thought called critical race theory. And it's important for those folks who are committed to the broader importance of a richer understanding of history, a fuller and complicated understanding of the nuances and the dynamism of race and racism, that when we enter these debates, that we are careful that we don't get drawn into some foolishness. And I just want to say that early on, because I understand the frustration. It's certainly unbelievably absurd in terms of what we're hearing. But it's important for us to always remain very clear about what we know. And what we know and what we learn from this broader body of thought that's referred to as critical race theory is that, race is a very significant and central issue in our society, first and foremost. We also know that it's socially constructed. We similarly know, and this is from decades and decades of research from folks who may call themselves critical race theorists. Many of them probably don't refer to themselves as that specifically. They probably think of themselves as scholars of race, maybe. But race and racism have been codified. They've been deeply woven into the structures of our society, largely because of legal and political developments. And we'll get into and we'll talk about some more of that. But also it's important for us to, as we develop and think through race and racism, that we indeed explore the intersections, those complicated nuances, such that we welcome new voices, important voices, new identities, valuable identities into a conversation where in many cases they have been forced to the margins, so that we indeed are thinking and using and employing notions associated with intersectionality as a part of that more complicated explanation. And then, of course, one of the, I think, really valuable and oftentimes overlooked components of the value of critical race theory is that it really asks us to center the voices and the lived experiences of folks who we don't always listen to. And those are the folks who are on the ground, like Angela Harris and others, who are really in the battle directly as they look to shape and form the young minds and to build in those young people a healthy sense of cultural and racial identity, and then also to make sure that they see themselves as folks who can have an impact and play a significant role in our society. That is as quick of a synopsis as I can provide, so I'll be quiet.
I think that's a pretty poignant synopsis. And taking a look at that too, we also see some of the struggles and the efforts that you and certainly very recently Angela and Nat and Tomika have been facing in different communities. I know that among other things, even the state legislature has taken to attempting to heavy-handedly dictate curricula and censor history through a series of dog whistles and apparent fear-mongering, not the least of which is the most recent Senate bill and Assembly Bill 411. Angela, I was so impressed by your strength and your eloquence and your bravery when you were addressing this recently. Would you care to speak a little as to what this is and what motivated you to step up?
So, good afternoon, everybody. So I had actually had the opportunity to get to see the bill before the public was even aware that it was coming out. So I knew that this was coming down the pipeline, and I was very concerned about the vagueness of the language. It talks about things like making students feel bad, based upon their gender and race. And that's a very, like relative concept, right? My perception about how someone makes me feel may not necessarily be their intent, right? And so it's extremely concerning to me as an educator, particularly as a first grade educator, because I think that it's my duty to begin to teach my students how to critically think about the systems that they're being educated in, even in first grade. And so it was important for me to go and speak against AB 411, but also to draw this line between what's happening now and things that have happened in the past. And I particularly talked about the abolitionist movement and the goal of folks during the abolitionist movement to really silence the voices of abolitionists who, you know, were trying to free enslaved folks. And so it's very similar to what's happening right now, right? People who are trying to talk about things like Black Lives Matter in their classrooms, talk about anti-racism, talk about equity. These are the modern day abolitionists. And so our voices are essentially, they're essentially trying to silence those voices and keep us stuck in the past. And so I wanted to draw that correlation because I think it's so important that if we don't learn from our history, we are doomed to repeat it. And that's what we see happening right now in this moment.
Very true and very poignant. And Nat, Nat and Tomika, I don't even know where to go next because I know that this is affecting all of us in a variety of communities across the state. But Nat, I've seen you have been following your stands on Facebook. You've been attending different school districts around Southeast Wisconsin. Can you tell us a little of what you've been seeing there and how that's affecting you and why you're even going to these places in the first place?
It started with Greendale, which is where my kids go to school, and the realization that in Greendale, and then later the realization that this is common across most suburban school districts, that students of color are consistently marginalized, that their experiences are dismissed, and that at least part of that has to do with how their people that look like them are taught about or not taught about in classes. And I do want to kind of backpedal that a little because there are some fantastic educators in Greendale schools, including the front of my kids' classes, who are really doing a great job of trying to achieve accurate representation and critical understanding of the role of race and class and gender and so on in American history, in literature, and even in subjects like physics and math. You know, there are some great educators there, but they're systemically, it's not coming from the system. That innovation, that positive stuff is not coming from the system. And again, it's bound up with stuff like discipline policies, which fall much more heavily on students of color, even when the ostensible intent is to protect often students who face marginalization and bullying, like zero tolerance policies, for example. Very frequently, even though the stated intent of zero tolerance bullying policies is to protect students who are more likely to be bullied, that is, most students are already marginalized, what we find is, and what we found in Greendale specifically with the case a couple of years ago, is that when a student who is marginalized, in this case a Black student, retaliates against another student who has marginalized them racially, the student was called the N-word in the hallway, and when the student responded verbally, not physically, verbally, they received basically a very harsh punishment for that, a suspension. And that's what really actually motivated me to get involved in school politics locally, and then realizing that this is not something we can address just at Greendale's own school board meetings, but it's something that really needs to be addressed in concert with parents like myself, community members like myself, who are really upset that this is happening, that our schools are perpetuating this kind of injustice. And that curriculum's part of it. You know, that's where CRT, what is called CRT, which, as Rob said, is often not actually technically CRT, but what is basically equitable and accurate teaching of American society and history, where that comes in. That's part of this as well. That's part of the marginalization of these students. That's why other students feel that it's not a problem to call them the N-word. That's why there's no understanding among administrators that when someone is called the N-word, it's as if they were being punched in the face, and that you have to accept a proportionate response from an adolescent who is not fully in control and has just been verbally punched in the face. So
it's a very accurate and a very painful description of what's happening. And I understand too that frequently now underrepresentation of Black students or students of color in school districts sometimes help to exacerbate this problem, because students, especially young Black children that are in these classes, are called upon to be like a spokesperson for some monolithic Black culture, as though, you know, all Black folks are the same. Your Black culture is just what this white author 50 years ago decided to put in this textbook, and now I want you to speak on this this topic. And I know this just, you know, having observed it and heard it often over and over and over again, but also from painful stories and some of the conflicts that that my friend Tomika has encountered over the course of time. And one of the things I think is most striking about the participation of the four of you on this panel is that, you know, we've got a teacher, we've got a parent, we've got a school board member, we've got a professor who studies these issues, and there's a lot of overlay in these things as well. Tomika, I was hoping maybe you'd speak to us in the role of a few of these different identities of both harkening back to some of the stories you shared with me of growing up a young Black girl here, as well as some of the things you've seen confronting you in the school board of the Glendale School District.
Thank you, Emilio. I was just kind of pondering over what and thank you for having me. What the panelists have been saying, I have a unique perspective. I was talking to one of the panelists yesterday, and I was like, why am I here with these powerhouses? You know, I'm just a school board member. And he told me something that I really thought about, which was I overlay the policy maker as well as the parent, as well as a product from a suburban school living in the city of Milwaukee. So there's so many different layers. And one of them is our school district. It's two things I want to like touch on. Number one, my school district is Glendale River Hill School District. This is the K4 through 8th grade school district that feeds into Nicolay. It's about 1,000 kids, so about the same size as the Nicolay School District in itself. But the makeup of it is 52% plus kids of color, with the majority of that school district being African American or Black. You wonder, how does that change things? Well, the taxpayers that are paying the bill is 85% white. But then you have a school district that is 52% Black. And how do you navigate that? You can't teach to the majority, and you have to teach to the majority. The majority is Black. What does that look like? And so our school board has, we've gone through some ups and downs, but I believe our school board is definitely on one accord in making sure that we preach equity. We are starting just now, we have just formed an equity and inclusion committee that is part of the policy committee of our school board. And it is the board, it's under the school board. So what we're trying to do is make sure that and this whole program will be community driven. These are the people who are paying, you know, the bills basically. But you also have to know what's going on. One of the things another thing I want to bring attention to, I kind of giggle when some in the bill, they were talking about making a child feel uncomfortable. I shared this with the Emilio and Chrissy, and I think it's important to share with you. I was in the 4th grade. We had to do a presentation on your background. Well, obviously I look Black, I am Black, that's what I am. And we had 6 Black kids in the class, in our 4th grade class completely. But I think 4 of them chose to have a group that they were some part of the Native American heritage. Which they were. And then there was myself and one other boy who we didn't have anything else but being Black. And I sat there, and it was, as much as I hate to say this, it was uncomfortable. I grew up on the city, 21st and Atkinson, right in the city, but I also went to Shorewood from K4 to 12th grade. And here, the only time I ever heard about anybody being Black doing anything great was Martin Luther King. We weren't even talking about Malcolm X at the time, because here I am 50 years old. So this is back in 77 when they first started to integrate the system. And then I remember, we talked a little bit about Rosa Parks, but the majority of it was slavery. And it made me uncomfortable, even though I was proud of it. Actually, I couldn't even be proud because I didn't know what pride was in 4th grade to be Black. I just knew I was, and I wasn't sad about it. It was just, this is what it was. But my whole surrounding was a bunch of white people. And all you saw was Black people in chains, Black people being oppressed. Never talked about, the man who invented, the stoplight, or the man who invented the filtration system for reefer trucks. I mean, we never talked about. So when we got ready to do this presentation, it was so uncomfortable. And I remember the boy that was with me, we were talking about African and African dances, because everybody kind of know that. And then he said, and we're African booty scratchers. And the whole class laughed because he was the class clown. And I laughed too, because it was like, oh, everybody's laughing. But as I think of it now, at the age of 49, that was extremely painful and horrible. And so and the question to me is, are these legislative people saying it's okay for Black children to be uncomfortable as long as my child is not uncomfortable? And that is the question. And I think that is the key to this. Why do you want this? What is the reason behind this legislation? What is the reason behind? Because critical race theory is evolving into inclusiveness, but putting these stamps and stopping, taking equity out of all your school policies. I've seen in some school boards where there's a bunch of people that are taking out the word equity and diversity out of it, so we can go back to, I think, what the National Lawyers Guild calls blindness, blindness, or not being able to see color anymore. Colorblind, that's what it was called. So this is important to me. I am a policymaker in that district, but I also have board members, and I don't speak for my board members because I can't, because we're a collective. But I think we're on one accord to make sure that, at least in our district, we're trying to do what we can. When I got on the school board almost 6 years, or a little over under 6 years ago, there was one Black teacher in that whole district. Now we're trying to diversify and make it better, but we've lost some. Now we're gaining some back. We have a group of diversified people. We have women, almost all women, who are running the school district right now. So these are the things, and I'm sorry I talk so long, but these are the things that, the questions we have to ask. And are you asking them to your policy makers? It doesn't matter if the teacher says something or anything. The policymakers are the school board, are the principals, are the assistant principals. Those are the people that they should be talking to.
Can I just jump in real quick, Emilio? I'm so glad that Tomika brought up that point, because I spoke about something very similar when the bill first came out. There was nothing in it. And even when you hear the legislators speak about it, they never talk about the ways that Black students and brown students are made to feel uncomfortable. We have teachers in our very state that have taught slave lessons. We've had students in our state who have come to school wearing sombreros and Mexican garb. We had students in Oak Creek that came to school wearing Burger King crowns. So all of these things have happened in our state. all of these things have made Black and brown students feel very uncomfortable. But to Tomika's point, right, it's not about the discomfort of the minority, it's about making the majority comfortable. So I'm so glad that she mentioned that.
And you're right on the point, Angela and Tomika. Thank you so much, Tomika. Panelists, this is your show. Nobody wants to listen to me. They all want to listen to you. So anytime you all want to jump in, that's beautiful. Tomika, thank you again for sharing that poignant story. It's always incredible how we experience things and then over the course of years process them and then gain deeper insight through the truths that we're slowly enveloping. And I just want to also give a shout out to Adekola Adadapo, who's joined us here as well, and said that she's in her 70s and had the same kind of experience in grade school that you did as well. So the painful thing about this and people trying to legislate this whitewashing and this forced colorblindness is that it's doomed to create more generational trauma for Black students that will continue to relive these experiences because their history will be hidden and their experiences minimized. I'd like to jump to some of the great questions we're receiving. We've got well over 100 people watching us on these two platforms, and we've received about 20 different questions, all incredible and incredibly varied. So start with the first question here, because we have a lot of people watching us from outside of Milwaukee as well. So the first of the questions that refers to outside of the Milwaukee and Madison area says, from Molly, the latest census data shows that all 72 of Wisconsin counties have become more racially and ethnically diverse. How can we support children in school districts outside of Milwaukee and Madison that might not have a history of deeply engaging with race and racism? And after we do that, I have a follow-up question from Brian Pfeiffer, who's asking with concern from the Northeast part of the state, something similar. So I open that up to any of you.
Well, one particular effort that we're engaged in over at Curdo is to, as much as possible, offer the opportunity for educators from any number of districts to come together and think through classroom strategies and curricular strategies. Part of what I think is really critical in this moment and has remained important is for educators across all levels to be in conversation about what materials are being used, creative ways to employ them in the classroom, and also the materials that resonate most with students. A lot of the conversations that we've been having with educators, the students are helping to inform us what works best for them. And to be perfectly honest, even when we work with teachers and students outside of a large urban district like ours, many of them are engaging in these topics in the most ardent and effective ways that they can, and they actually need some support as they are in environments where it can be very hostile for them to continue to do that kind of work in the classroom. And so, and one great example is, the city of Milwaukee has this rich history of civil rights activism, a story that includes the woman this particular conversation and subsequent conversations are named after. And we have a responsibility to make sure every child knows that woman's name and knows her history, and all the other folks who are authors of that great story of Milwaukee civil rights upsurges in the 1950s and 60s. We don't have to look elsewhere for those stories. But what we then are able to do, thanks to decades of work from folks who might be referred to as critical race theorists, we can also tell those stories in rich and dynamic ways that we probably couldn't tell 3 decades ago or 2 decades ago. Now we're just smarter about how to effectively not only talk about discrimination, not only talk about the devastating histories that have promoted inequality that persists today, but then also the heroic ways in which people have resisted and the ways that folks have maintained and secured their own sense of dignity in the face of that oppression. And so there's much to do in terms of supporting fellow educators so that we can tell not only the stories of oppression, but then also the ways that folks overcome and maintain that dignified sense of self.
I think I would also like to say that you don't need Black or brown students or Black and brown educators in your district to do race and racism work. I think that it's really important. I say this all the time. I think that it's really important to begin with the internal first, to interrogate how race and racism plays a role in your life, right? How you've addressed issues of white supremacy within your own self. And then that allows you to be able to better have those conversations in your classroom spaces, right? Because you have done your self work, and then that allows you to go into the classroom space and really engage your students in a conversation that isn't about your personal biases or the things that are inherent to you. You can engage them in an authentic conversation around race and racism. And I actually prefer for folks to not lean on, like Tomika said, to not lean on their Black students or lean on the Black and brown educators in their district to do this kind of work. And to Dr. Smith's point, right? Like, you need to find your tribe. Who are the folks in your school district that are already doing this kind of work? How can you connect with them? And like Dr. Smith said, sit down and begin to have conversations about how, you can best inform your practice using these kind of tools.
Two of the things that I wanted to bring up is the engagement part of this. And I'm not speaking for any school board besides my own right now, but one of the things that our school board decided is not to hire an equity director. And the reason being is it turns into the equity director's problem when something happens. They, not that they're not great at what they do and you don't need, but when you're trying to navigate some of this stuff, all of a sudden, if there is a race issue, well, what did the equity director do? And it's been put on that one person. And our school board, when we decided, when we were even talking about it, it's like, it's everybody's job, from the principal, the superintendent, all the way down to the janitors. It is your job to do this. One of the other things I want to talk is policy. WASB, Wisconsin Association of School Boards. I have been a delegate for the WASB for, I think, 5 years now. And I believe there is approximately 472, give or take, 464 school districts here. Now, each group, each district gets one representative. Now look at that closely, because it's very important. So if we want to talk about WASB and what they can do, let's see the majority school districts that have kids of color. You add them up, it's maybe 10. So I remember a couple of years ago when they were doing this, I think it was I don't know if it was an equity or a diversity type policy. And I got up and I said, why are you arguing with me? First, I asked how many people identify as people of color in this room. It was myself, I think one other woman, and a gentleman. I said, so there's 3 people that this policy will affect, but we're asking 400 other people to decide when it has nothing to do with them. I said, you should be asking us what this policy should look like. But we need to do something about that. They control what basically the districts ask the legislature for. If we had more diversity, and I'm talking about not necessarily Black and brown or LGBT, if we had more diversity thinking people on these boards, this would be a huge gain, because I wouldn't have to be the only spokesperson at the table, because I'm the only Black elected at the table at that time. So I think definitely school board races matter. And this all ties into what you're educating, because they are the people who are going to be okaying that curriculum. These are the people that are going to be okaying who that superintendent is. They're going to be okaying if you get free or reduced lunch or not. These are the people that you need to engage with. So school board is not a easy job. One other thing is I am blessed, completely blessed, that I don't have so much negativity when it comes to some of the things. Our parents here are pushing forward with some of the things. You know, you have the naysayers here and there, but the majority of the school district is like, go, let's do this, let's be great. So I have an easy job on my school board because our community kind of follows it, but it's not the same everywhere.
Yeah, I want to connect to a question from the chat, which I just realized I answered only to the panelists because I'm not very good at Zoom, I guess. But so I'll answer it verbally, and that's from Karen Zimmerman. Asked what we can do to support the more inclusive and accurate teaching in schools. And I think one thing you can do is, as Tomika said, support school board members, vote for school board members who make it clear that that's a priority in school board races. Go to forums, ask those questions, make it clear that there is part of the community at least that cares about this. That's how priorities get moved up. And then go to school board meetings once people are elected and speak up and say, my kid will benefit from this, or I don't have a kid in the classroom, but I pay taxes and I want my taxes to go towards this kind of inclusive teaching that turns out not just kids of color who understand who haven't been through X many years of having their identity systematically devalued and come out as more confident and competent people, but also if you have white students, it's good for them too. They cannot go out into the world that we have today with the kind of white supremacists messaging that an education that doesn't include this, that doesn't appreciate this, will send them out. They will be in front of it. They say SNAP for starters. So you've got to go to school boards and say, I support this. This is good for my kids, no matter what background they have. In different ways, it's good for all of them. It's what we need for our graduates of our high schools to be successful in the modern world, to be the kind of people we want to live next door to, to be good members of society. It doesn't matter. Well, it does matter what background your kids are, but it matters to all of them that they get this kind of education. And if you can go as parents and as taxpayers and say, this is what I want to see done, that gives support to the school board members who are in favor of this. That gives support to the teachers who are teaching this, but maybe getting parent feedback, negative parent feedback. You can go and say, okay, so you want to hire an equity director? Well, just so you know, we'll be watching to make sure that equity director doesn't become the sole person who has all responsibility for equity in the district. We want to make sure that person is, as Tomika said, responsible at the very least for ensuring that everybody has a responsibility for equity. You can drive. School boards are small. They're small political environments. You can drive policy by just turning up much more effectively than you might think you can.
And Nat, to your point, and this is being asked by a few folks, I want to touch upon something and then jump into some other work you've done and a threat that people in out of Milwaukee County, out of Dane County school boards are facing. But I just want to back up for one piece for defining terms. And I've seen a popular shirt that says Erasism, and I hadn't understood it to mean to erase racism. But then another friend of mine, this was just reminded to me by a comment from Jacob Abrams in the chat, but another Native friend of mine talked about how this type of bill, this SB 411, AB 411, right now seems to be focusing on the perspective of Black students and Black history and wanting to keep Black children ignorant of the many contributions of Black folks, and also preventing white children from learning about America's true history. But it's also adding to the narrative of Native folks, for example, being completely eradicated from history. We just talk about Native children. Oh, it's Thanksgiving. Native people invented Thanksgiving. Yay. And some stuff happened in the 1800s. And here's a picture of a teepee. And then there's no genuine discussion of the myriad voices that comprise our culture, which is a huge threat to us socially and economically, as you've raised, Nat. And this goes for every other non-white group, Hmong, Karen, her folks. Oh, they came here after Vietnam, and that's all anyone knows. Act 31 in the state, even the concept of teaching Native American studies just being a blip on the screen is very painful. But I do want to, before we take a look at that, also ask what can people do in school districts to counteract the overwhelming push by conservative and racist people? And I'm not saying all conservative people are racist, but in this instance, there's an overlay of both conservative and racist people working to remove the conversation of race or bloodshed from our history, or things that might make a white child feel uncomfortable with what happened at the expense of the truth and at the expense of the feelings of non-white children. I was hoping you could tell me a little bit about what your group, which I believe is called PAGE, has been doing, as well as what's some advice, and this is open also to Angela, who I know has a big perspective on this across the state, and Tomika, for school districts where people are actively pressuring, trying to kick off. I know a lot of Mequon parents pulling their children from public schools in Mequon and trying to put them in parochial and private institutions like University School, Divine Savior, Holy Angels, and other places, because they're worried about how those school districts are reacting poorly to adverse conservative pressure on them.
Yeah, so thanks for giving a shout out to PAGE. People Advocating for Greendale Equity is our group, and I think nowadays, Tomika, maybe you can confirm this, pretty much most of the ring districts around Milwaukee have a group like that. I mean, I'm really surprised. As New Berlin has one, Mequon has one, that are working towards equity as some kind of goal in their schools and in their communities. So again, we were founded after that incident in late 2018, a student being called the N-word and responding verbally, being suspended, and kind of highlighting the fact that the school administration was not really cognizant of how students of color live in the environment they create. And so that's kind of our broad goal. We've branched out into community work as well as schools, because the schools don't exist without the community that creates the environment and pays the taxes and so on. And yeah, so we pushed for the equity director because we felt like we at least needed somebody to pay attention to this. I think our environment was maybe a little different to Tomika's, where it was not sympathetic until we raised it. And so, yeah, we got that. We got an integrated curriculum and an equity director. We were not particularly pleased about it being a split responsibility, because again, we wanted that person who was really kind of a person to guide that. But it's better than it was, for sure. We got some significant funding from both the schools and the village itself to fund equity-based programming. So, for example, we brought Reggie Jackson in to talk about the history of residential segregation in Greater Milwaukee, and in the context of the U.S., how it operated in the U.S., and then specifically in Greendale. And in fact, a couple of our members went to the Greendale sign opposite Southridge Mall the other day, and did a photo shoot commemorating the fact that the development that is just across 76th Street from Southridge was set up in 1958, 10 years after the Supreme Court ruled the enforcement of restrictive covenants, only allowing white people to live in certain housing. That was ruled in 48 unenforceable and unconstitutional. Well, this development in 1958 by a developer whose son, I think, or grandson is still a fairly major player in Greendale politics. All those homes had restrictive covenants. So this is how we get to be a predominantly white community, is that even the Supreme Court, I mean, you can't enforce it by law, after 1948, but it says something to still stick it in the deeds of your houses that you're building. So, we try to draw attention to these things, try to point out, this isn't your fault, white person who happens to be in the audience. It's the way society is. It's embedded in a much larger power structure and set of systems, but you can do something about it now, and it at least helps you understand why your community is the way it is. And if you don't like that, and we kind of hope you don't, we kind of hope that you want, like us, to have your community become more welcoming to a more diverse population, to be the kind of place that anyone wants to move to, where you don't move here for schools and then discover that these schools are actually really toxic for your kids, which has been the experience of some parents of color in districts like Greendale. They want to come here because there's high achievement, but there's problems with that, severe problems with that. Then you can do something about it. But you have to acknowledge that things have happened to make it that way. And so we're engaged in this kind of ongoing process of education, trying to shift cultural perspective. And of course, then along comes this whole nationwide thing about CRT, which, as people have noted in the chat, is nationally orchestrated. The bills are templates. They are not. It is not Robin Voss sitting in his office drafting a bill. It is Robin Voss sitting in his office getting an email from national groups that are powerful, that are working from outside, that aren't from Wisconsin. This is a coordinated national effort to change the way nationwide history is taught. And what we need to do is be the local voices that speak up and say, no, Wisconsinites don't want this change. We want to continue down the path of greater equity. We want to improve the curriculum in terms of more inclusiveness and more accuracy. And so that's kind of what we were pushing now, I think, in Page, and again, other groups in other districts around the metro areas.
I think one of the things that I've noticed is a very basic, not even a very basic level understanding, no understanding at all of what words like equity, anti-racism, implicit bias, culturally relevant teaching mean. And so because they don't understand what those terms mean, they have just now supplanted them into critical race theory. And so I think one thing that can really happen against the anti-CRT folks is a full-fledged information campaign. Like, we are going to define these terms. We are going to define how they're used in our classroom spaces, in our schools, and in our districts, so that you can have a better understanding of how this work happens, where it's happening, when it's happening, and why. I think that, because Milwaukee was so far ahead with like the Black Lives Matter resolution and the equity resolutions and all of those things, we don't really suffer from a lot of blowback that is happening in suburban areas and the counties that are farther up north. But because a lot of this language is new to people, they don't know what it means. And now you have these fear mongers who are like, oh, that's critical race theory, when that's absolutely not the case. So I think that one thing that you could do right now is begin to inform yourself on what those terms are. And when you go to school board meetings and speak about critical race theory, begin to identify the differences between equity and critical race theory, right? Let's identify what the difference is between critical race theory and culturally relevant teaching. And that's one of the ways that you could combat that right now.
Wonderful book from both of you. Before I get on to another response, I also want to share something I saw here in the chat, which seems to be another strategy that can be utilized. I see our friends over and co-sponsors from the Jewish Community Relations Council, Andrea Bernstein, writes that in response to the question about educating in rural and suburban districts, also, the JCRC is offering a program called Listening Library for elementary schools, which offers intentionally curated free books that include racially, ethnically, religiously, culturally diverse authors and characters, along with lesson packets and teacher reflection dialogue sessions. It helps teachers to develop a lens with which to look at their classroom approaches and materials, as well as their own blind spots. The program focuses on building and affirming positive identities, as well as language to talk about and to celebrate differences. Was offered in 3 rural suburban districts in Wisconsin, and they're accepting new districts for the school year. And I think that also underscores, Angela, what you were saying. If we don't learn about our history, we're doomed to repeat it. those of you on the panel and those of you also following along on Facebook, there is a robust discussion, and there's a lot of love for you panelists in the chat here. I'm going to do my best working with Chrissy to see how we can capture this, and then on on our website at least, as well as YouTube, where we'll be archiving to share this, because there's an incredible amount of information there, as well as URLs.
Hey, I'm gonna jump in real quickly. I want to kind of echo Angela's comments and see if I can bring some more context to this. Absolutely. Critical race theory is not anti-racism training. It's not equity work. It's this very, in many respects, densely academic examination of the nation's problems with race, you know, complicating it in all the ways it needs to be complicated, pulling on threads that need to be pulled on to get to a deeper understanding of truth. And what that then allows for is the opportunity for that body of research and connected bodies of research that wouldn't fall under the umbrella, but does some of the same kind of stuff, to then be employed in the classroom, right? And at various levels of education. But what it has also done, which I think is really critical to this moment, it's that body of scholarship, those bodies of scholarship, has led to a very informed activist community. And we saw that last year in very brilliant ways. And so as much as this may feel like a response to an intellectual set of thoughts and ideas, it's also a response to last year's upsurge in demonstrations and demands on the part of folks who were very clear about what their concerns were, and were also very clear about what structures of government need to respond in order to address that. And so when you are able to couple those kinds of rich, informed ideas with street activism, and activism that really can propel us to think seriously about change in very profound and for some folks, I'm sure, scary ways, that can incite this kind of backlash moment. It's not necessarily a backlash moment, but I do think a lot of what we're seeing is in direct response to the tens of millions of folks who took to the streets last year. And they took to the streets extraordinarily informed about what the issues were and what needed to be addressed, right? And it's that we're role modeling so much of it in this conversation, right? You have some academic components to it. You have on the ground components to it. You have policy and legally informed concerns and ways to address those unfair policies and laws. And so this is it right here, and this is the threat. Let's be very clear about that, right? Social change is not, it does not occur without these kinds of clashes. And so we're a part of this rich moment, and we're role modeling what I think are some of the key components to CRT and other offshoots and connections.
So before we jump to another question, I just want to draw attention to the fact that people are listing many more resources and many more groups popping up in different areas. You've got Bay Bridge, you've got the groups forming in Cedarburg and in Grafton with Erica Turner. You've got resources like from Race Forward, which are being elevated. And I think a lot of this goes to help address some of what you were saying, Rob and Angela, about these misdefinitions and these misguided information, the fact that folks really don't know what they're talking about, and we need to begin taking some steps forward. Tomika, I'm wondering if you can add a little to this from the viewpoint to what you're seeing now or hearing in the North Shore area. I see in Shorewood and Glendale and Whitefish Bay and Fox Point a lot of people coming together and conflating some of these issues, and in Mequon, probably even further north from you, overlaid issues and trying to make this unified front of no masks, no vaccines, no critical race theory, no unleaded fuel. I have no idea what they're adding next to this docket, but I'm wondering if you've seen this conflation of ideas affecting you up in the Glendale School District.
Well, it's kind of a catch-22 twofold type thing. In the Glendale River Hills district, which is mostly Glendale and parts of River Hills, when we did our survey, I think I recall like 85% of the people said they were neutral, they were wanted to do mask, and it was only a small portion that said absolutely no mask or didn't care. So I am blessed in that perspective that we're doing masks, and and I think our board was, we are going to be safe. We're going to make sure our kids are safe. The problem is, and I feel sometimes, and going back to one of the things that Professor Smith said was, do they know what they're really arguing about? And one of the things that I want to intentionally do is talk about these things. Like, people think they know what critical race theory is. Do they really know? Do people really understand the significance of wearing a mask or not? I mean, they are listening. I think you say this time and time and again, Emilio, people are learning and being educated by memes. And when they see that, they take it as face value. And we, as an educator, at least in the school district, we need to keep iterating the science. We are educating kids. So we're going to make sure they get educated with facts of science. It's to the point of, yeah, these school board members may take a beating. But me personally, if I was unelected or not elected again for something that I truly believed in, I'm okay with that. I'm never going to, my whole philosophy has always been students first, parents second, administrative third. You know, so whatever is best for the students, whatever, and then that is what I'm going to give them. 9 times out of 10, the students and the teachers are right to connect it together. So that's why they're not incorporated in that. But you have to have a thick skin to be on these school boards. You can't be wishy-washy. You can't think that your life is going to end if you vote no on something or you vote against something. It's not. You're going to keep going. You're going to live on, but you're also going to be able to look at yourself in the mirror. Know that there is nothing that is going to pressure you. People, and another thing that are elected, I keep going back to the policy and the political parts of this because it is so important. Even on the statewide elections, you know, these are the people who are making these policy choices. That's what we all have to look at. And we have to see who is leading us. That's it. I don't care if they're Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal. If they are not jiving with what your fundamental issues are and what you believe in, then get rid of them or put them in office. And that is the basic of what I say, because local government is so important. It's all about our school board. It's all about our cities. These are nonpartisan places. And these are where you're going to make the most impact on our children, on our families. So I just really push that. And also one other thing, step up and run for some of these school boards. It's a hard thing to do, but stepping up and saying, I am going to be that voice for the people who won't be able to do it, who can't do it, who, you know, may not financially be able to sit in a meeting, or they work at night, or they have too many children and they have to take care of it. You know, whatever it is, be that voice for those people. And I think if we get to those things, this will start getting better.
Well put, my friend. I have one last question, and we have so many questions from commenters, and then one thing to draw attention to what you were saying, Tomika, about running for office and putting pressure on things. You'll see comments in the chat too from Chris Steele and others, giving links to WASB, giving the links to rural and suburban and urban groups that you can put pressure on who are lobbying against this, and contacting your elected officials, especially if you're living in communities like Nat and like Tomika, who are a little north or south of the larger urban districts, where people might have more, they believe more of the misconceptions of these things, and less understand what it is they're discussing is super important. And sharing these resources, and maybe even sharing a copy of this conversation once it's on YouTube with other people, so that I'm thrilled with the depth that all of you have been providing for this. I want to get to a fundamental question that my friend Jaime Alvarado asks from Ridding Racism Milwaukee. And originally he directed it to Professor Rob, but I'd like to open this up to all of you. Why is it important that a young person learn about their racial identity?
So I always like to talk about this because this is the work that my school does. You know, Dr. King is an African-American immersion school. It is the longest standing African-American immersion school, 30 years, and the only public African-American immersion school in our nation. This school was created because folks realized that the system of education wasn't created to educate Black students. And so they wanted to create a space where Black students had the ability to come and learn about themselves. And when I talk about the way that we learn about ourselves, we don't learn about our enslavement. We learn about the time prior to our enslavement, and we learn about the things that we've contributed to this nation since our enslavement. We very rarely talk about the times that we were enslaved because that has been so much of our history. I think that is so important for them to understand who they are, because to Tomika's point, in fourth grade, she didn't know what it meant to have pride in being Black. She didn't know what it meant to have Black joy. And so now they will go into school spaces, whether they continue to stay at Dr. King or leave, they will go into other school spaces understanding that they aren't a burden on society, that there have been many contributions that have been made by Black people in this nation and beyond, right? And so that they can be proud of that. I think that on the reverse end, it's also important, right, for non-Black students to learn about their history, right? And learn about the mistakes that were made. So again, to that point I made earlier, so that we don't repeat those things. But when you know yourself, that's how you begin to interrogate the systems in which you live, right? I show up, I know who I am, I know what I bring to the table, and now I can begin to think critically about the systems that I live in, that I'm educated in, you know, all of those things. And so I think that that's why it's so important. And it becomes, you know, we have this idea in America about like this whole melting pot, but us understanding our own individual identities makes us more of like a mixed salad, right? We each understand the ingredients that we bring to the salad to make it great. And so I think that that is, you know, the future that I hope for my students and for my children, is that they understand and appreciate their identities so that they can better understand and appreciate others' identities as well.
You know, and building off of that, Angela, you can't tell the story of the United States and not include all these other people, whether they are of African descent, indigenous. You can just go around the globe. I mean, if we go back to that melting pot salad analogy, you can't accurately tell the history if you don't include those other voices. Now, of course, once those young, because, and Angela and Nat, others too, and who are joining us, we know that moment. There's nothing more brilliant than that moment where that child sees herself in the story of this nation, and not as simply a person or a body that's been acted upon, but instead as a contributor and a full functioning citizen in this society. And once that happens, then that young person can begin to develop the strength and the confidence to demand what's entitled to them as a function of that citizenship. And that's the threat. So let's keep doing it.
One of the other things that I want to say is this teaching helps our kids value themselves. It's a huge self-esteem booster. We are not just the people who, we're in chains. We are inventors. We are innovators. Native Americans are not the only people. The only thing they know is that they stole their land from. I mean, they have contributed as well. It is so many contributions to this so-called melting pot, but are the contributions being told? And that is when you get a well-rounded, this is who all contributed to where America is today. That is when our nation grows. That's when our kids grow. And if they want to so-called get rid of racism, that's how you start with like, wait a minute, my ancestors didn't do all this by themselves. We contributed. So we have a right to be part of this conversation.
Just a real quick story. I remember I was mentoring a group of 6th and 7th grade girls, and they were talking about 6th and 7th black girls, grade black girls. And they were talking about how they were so tired of learning about Black people in history and like the things that they invented. And they were like, Miss Harris, tell us something that a Black person invented that's relative to us right now, that we can relate to right now. And I was like, I bet you don't know, a Black person invented the super soaker. So like just little things like that, right? Like kids are not aware that we are, not only did we contribute historically, but we continue to contribute every single day. And so like, and that's making it relevant, right, to their learning experience right there in the moment. They don't want to learn about Gary Morgan and the stoplight. They want to learn about people who are doing things in real time that they can recreate, right? So that is just another component of their identity and like them wanting to know more about themselves so that they can feel like, to Tomika's point, that they are valued and also a valuable contribution to our society.
I want to come in and go back to just the effect of centering the voices and experiences of marginalized people, and particularly of Black Americans in our national story. And that's, and I want to go back to the 1619 Project, which is also another kind of root of this, and the way in which the 1619 Project reorients American history and says, look at all these things that are really kind of central to US history and the development of our society, and let's trace how they are all connected to the experience of Black Americans, often the founding fact of slavery. But also there's one chapter in it that really talks about how Black Americans have defined what freedom means precisely because they were deprived of it. And that if we look at freedom and liberation movements in the United States, almost all their strategies were first tried out by Black people seeking their liberation. And that's another way to put it into, to valorize the experiences of our Black students, and to say, look, you didn't, I mean, yeah, you invented the super soaker, that's really fun and cool. But maybe at high school we can say, look, you invented how we think of democracy. People like you, your ancestors, are responsible for our democracy functioning the way it is. And they're also responsible for this backlash that we're dealing with, which does not want to see that democracy embrace its fullness in that way. I mean, let's be very blunt about this, that this is an anti-democratic effort that seeks to silence voices and seeks to go back to a more restricted form of democracy, which is not democratic. And this is a really American thing to do, is to teach this inclusive and accurate curriculum, and to empower, because it empowers people, as you said, empowers students who otherwise would be disempowered and marginalized. And so, all these ways that we can do to kind of raise these kids up and say, look, you can do this. Don't let people tell you that just because of the situation you're born into, the skin you're born into, you can't do this. Because people like you have really defined what America is in fundamental ways.
Well, and another very related example is student rights and responsibilities on college campuses. The idea of student due process emerges out of Black student protests. We often locate it somewhere over in Berkeley, but that's almost a decade or so after these young folks who were involved in sit-ins and everything else are really sort of revolutionizing student rights on campus. And I regularly say to folks, faculty, staff, students, that if we're going to talk about any kind of issue associated with students and due process and all that, let's also make sure that we are protecting the students who actually authored that whole idea in the 1950s and 60s. Let's make sure we're attending to the needs and the support mechanisms of those students too, because they're the ones who crafted what we even think about in terms of student rights on campuses, alongside lawyers who were some of the architects of critical race theory.
Friends, I'm going to pause this conversation at this moment. I want to thank you all. I want to thank you, panelists. I want to thank you, Rob and Nat, Angela, Tomika. I want to thank you, Chrissy. I want to thank you, listeners and folks who attended this. If you enjoyed this, our inaugural conversation, our premiere of the Vel Phillips Forum, I certainly did. I'm thrilled with this, and I really am enjoying this new face of who the Milwaukee Turners are. Each of these panelists also card-carrying Milwaukee Turners. It fills me with joy. And I want to tell you from the bottom of my heart, I feel like you've all honored Vel Phillips' memory and service with your actions. We are going to continue to do this. We're going to continue to have these critical conversations and sharing. I love the community that's building up here in the chat too, folks I've never seen, sharing information, sharing opinions, sharing their love and support for you all and what you're doing. And I hope to continue seeing you here several times a month and hopefully in person. I'm going to invite you all to join us again next on September 14th. We're going to have a little book talk on new books on Black liberation and romantic friendship. It's going to be presented by historians Dr. Robert Smith and Dr. Allison Clark Efford, who are going to discuss the contemporary relevance of their recently published edited collections, including Dr. Smith's Black Liberation from Reconstruction to Black Lives Matter, which presents selected sources organized around big questions and is excellent for classroom use. The link for that is in the chat, and I'll share it with you via email, all of you who have joined us here on our Facebook. And Dr. Efford and Dr. Victoria Bilich's Radical Relationships, the Civil War era correspondence of Matilda Anarchy, covers the German Milwaukee and feminist life between 1859 and 1865, especially her intense cohabitating relationship with another woman. I invite you all to break bread with us and share in commemorating the life and the incredible sacrifice of Mildred Fish Harnack, September 19th, here at the Milwaukee Turners parking lot. Mildred Fish Harnack was a Milwaukeean and the only American, and certainly the only woman, sentenced to death by Adolf Hitler for her responsibility in helping to lead the German resistance against Nazis. We'll have a barbecue and some food and some cupcakes and probably a rousing round of singing Bella Ciao in a couple of languages from 3 to 6 p.m. on the 19th. I invite you to come visit our lovely hall for Doors Open Milwaukee, September 25th and 26th. We are copying and we'll share the chat with you. And until next time, my friends, take care of one another, and we'll see you soon. I really appreciate all of you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you all so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Take care, friends. Thanks again.
Thank you.
We'll share the contact information too. I see this popping up, and also my cell phone. We'll share the public contact information with the panelists. I think you've got a lot of folks who want to talk to you all. Have a great day, everybody.